Hi, welcome back to a conversation about knitting as resistance. Since my first couple of videos to Hank Green and SciShow about their error-riddled video on knitting and physics went really viral, I'm going to take every opportunity to continue to nerd out on the subject of knitting and fiber arts. Please go back and watch part 1. It is about the contribution of women knitters to the Revolutionary War. In that video and in this one, I am referencing a piece called Knitting as Dissent, Female Resistance in America Since the Revolutionary War by Tova Hermanson. So moving forward in time to the Civil War. In the fall of 1864, Sojourner Truth, a proto-feminist and civil rights activist, traveled to refugee camps of freed people where she would demonstrate sewing, knitting, and cooking to teach people skills that might allow them to become financially independent. And obviously, in any war effort throughout our history, the work of women knitting to clothe soldiers has been incredibly important. Knitting was also a symbol of the suffrage movement in this time. Let's take, for example, Victorian activist Clorinda Nichols, who managed to become a member of Kansas's first state constitutional convention, where she demanded expanded rights for women. Paradoxically, deemed an unwomanly pursuit. Right, it was seen as mannish for a woman at that time to want to attend a political event like a constitutional convention. The entire time at the convention, Nichols had her knitting out and was working on it. And it's interesting because a lot of people have hypothesized she's not the only one who has done this, right? And we see throughout history that, again, men undervalue knitting as a craft. And when they see women engaging in something they see as domestic and cozy, woman's work, they tend to undervalue or underestimate the women that are connected to that knitting that they are observing. It's been hypothesized that Nichols' predilection for knitting as a traditional feminine pastime tricked male members into underestimating her and her crusade for more liberal property rights for women. Knitting as resistance, knitting as revolution, knitting as dissent, knitting as skillfulness, knitting as subversion, all connected to women throughout United States history. Paradoxically, though, knitting began to fall out of fashion, especially with younger women, after women gained the right to vote. It wasn't really until the Depression of the 1930s that we saw much more of a resurgence of knitting, and then really it boomed during the 1940s. Now, during both World Wars, knitting was used as propaganda and to set certain expectations of women, which I find really interesting. There's a lot of imagery from both World Wars of women knitting for soldiers at the front. And that work was really important, especially during the First World War and definitely during the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. But by the Second World War, that kind of knitting could be done much more quickly and efficiently by machine knitting in factories. There was this push for women to feel that they were contributing to the war effort, to build up patriotism in women, to help them feel connected and supportive of the war movement by giving them handwork to do. Knitting became this piece of propaganda, this symbolism of support for the war effort. Let me read here. Though wars were certainly not waged specifically to tether women back to feminine pursuits like knitting, they were exploited as convenient opportunities to tap into women's desire for patriotic acknowledgement. To wit, women's historical ability to combine female handiwork duties with war organization was called into play during both the First and Second World Wars, even as women took over men's industrial jobs as well. Women would come home from working in the factory all day and they would knit socks for soldiers at the front. The Red Cross led government-sponsored knitting initiatives asking women to, quote, express with your knitting needles that sympathetic love for those war refugees who suffer, and to keep American troops warm abroad by making socks, mufflers, sweaters, etc. Knitters also were asked to make things like amputee stump covers and bandages. Though, again, as I said, these items could be made quicker and more cost effectively through industrial methods, right? We had machine knitting back then. There was actually a fair amount of, frankly, patronizing propaganda at the time. Knitting for victory posters were common. They would say things like, remember Pearl Harbor, Pearl harder. And then there was this piece in Life magazine in 1941 that said, to the great American question, what can I do to help the war effort? The commonest answer yet found is knit. An avid knitter herself, Eleanor Roosevelt launched the World War II patriotic knitting fad at a Knit for Defense tea in 1941. She was frequently photographed with knitting in her lap. But it was this patronizing idea in the popular culture at the time that like knitting was the main way that women could help the war effort. And like, y'all, they were working industrial jobs. They were doing men's work while men were at the front. There were women who were serving in the armed forces who were at the front. Women were also growing food, canning food. Women were doing all kinds of other labor for the war effort. But there was this use of knitting as like the thing. It was paramount that all women be knitting for the war effort. It became this really patriotic symbol. Unfortunately, because of that, when you look at what came in the decades after, particularly feminists in the 1960s and 70s, there was this view that knitting was a symbol of women's historical subjugation by men. Second wave feminists generally viewed knitting as a symbol of women's oppression, something that bound women to their homes and occupied them in an invisible form of unrewarded labor. Don't get me started on what I think about second wave feminists and their critique of tasks and skills and crafts and roles that are seen as traditionally feminine. Instead of understanding their undervalued power and contribution, we see a lot of this like, these are just symbols of oppression. Women should move beyond these things. Meanwhile, if you look at knitting patterns from the 60s and 70s, there are so many subversive knitting patterns that have very political messages on them. A lot of the knitting I do, color work knitting I do, has text or images that have a political message. And I draw a lot of my inspiration from knitters from the 1960s. Speaking of knitting, I have an interruption. What are you wearing, Ruth?
Oh, I am wearing your halibut sweater.
Okay, sorry for the interruption. So, perversely, in the name of feminism, many women willfully rejected the importance and value of women's knitting precisely because it had always been a dominantly female activity. In her thesis, Unraveling Myths, Knitting and the Impact of Feminism During the 60s and 70s, Toby Voigt found that even among women who now chose to knit recreationally, many did not feel the feminist movement influenced their decision to knit. Knitting, they repeated over and over, was a personal choice, while feminism was a public political movement. Most of the knitters at that time failed to see a correlation between the two. That's like a whole other rabbit hole rant I could go down about second wave feminism and how it viewed traditionally feminine roles and pursuits as anti-feminist and how much harm was done by that. So it took a while for folks to reclaim knitting, to understand the way it has been utilized throughout history as women in a very political way. Not just that, in like a pleasurable way. Knitting is something you can enjoy, especially when you're living under fascism. Anything that brings you joy is inherently an act of resistance. So in recent decades, we've seen this youth-driven revival of yarn arts, right? After the 1980s, I learned to knit in 1997 when I was 18 years old. And there really was an uptick in knitting at that time. I went to Grinnell College, and that's where I learned to knit. My friend Kathy taught me. Shout out, Kathy. There was a company at that time that was owned by the parents of a Grinnellian called Peace Fleece. I mean, man, if you want to get into knitting being political, Peace Fleece was about blending American and Russian wool and Israeli and Palestinian wool back in the 90s. Anyway, that was the first yarn I ever knit anything with, was Peace Fleece. We really saw this uptick and we saw this proliferation of yarn companies since the 90s, very small cottage industries. And at the same time, we see much more knitting as activism. Knitting became a hallmark of slow fashion, a movement against capitalism, the unsustainability of fast fashion, and an inherently activist craft. In the last couple of decades, reclaiming traditional skills and crafts has been seen as feminist, anti-capitalist, and radical, a pushback against the unsustainability of late-stage capitalism. Then we get into the era of things like knit-ins, or very political large knitted pieces, yarn bombing. The Take Back the Night movement was paired with the Take Back the Knit movement. It was the Little Red Sweater Project where folks were encouraged to knit a tiny sweater. They collected them up in order to get a sweater to represent every soldier killed in Iraq since 2003. Knitters, the hobby itself, the act of knitting in public, coordinated demonstrations around knitting, choosing to put symbols and text on knitted garments. Knitting is politics. It is used as resistance. It is used as dissent. And that's just here in the US. I haven't even gotten into the history of knitting and spy work in Europe in both world wars. I'm telling y'all, knitting as resistance, knitting as dissent, This is the tip of the iceberg.